Good evening and welcome to Bermuda's News and Views. I'm your host, Don Burgess. And with me tonight for the sixth straight year, I think it is, to talk about the pre-budget, Cheryl Packwood and Craig Simmons. Welcome.
Thank you for having us, Don.
Thank you.
So just looking at the pre-budget, just for everyone out in the audience, that's just a proposal that the government has, what they may put in the budget, trying to get feedback from the public, see what flies, what doesn't fly, sort of like a trial balloon for them in a sense. So not tomorrow, but Friday, the budget will be unveiled, and there'll always be things that people love and like about it, and there'll be things that will have people gnashing their teeth and filling up the comment boards across the internet. We'll start with you, Craig. What impressed you about the pre-budget, if anything?
Wow.
We'll start with something deep to start.
Yeah. I think it tells me how little space the minister has to sort of wriggle in, so to speak. The Tax Reform Commission was set up many, many years ago, and it made a number of recommendations, and the government has been slow to implement most of those recommendations. And so the whole point behind the Tax Reform Commission was to broaden the base. And so it's almost like the finance minister is trying to get blood out of a stone. He's extracted just about everything he can extract from the system as it stands. And he seems timid about enacting some of the recommendations that were contained in the Tax Reform Commission. The one that comes to mind would be a value-added tax that would tax services, because customs duties only do goods. So when I get my nails done, there is no tax applied to that particular service. That would do a lot to bring in additional funds. And the other one is to tax capital. Labor is relatively heavily taxed in Bermuda through the payroll tax, and capital gets an easy ride. And so he really needs to go after capital, and he needs to go after services, and he hasn't really done a very good job of it to this point.
Well, I think I'm going to interpret when you say it's so little wiggle room with entitlement programs that we already have. I think the figure is correct that our interest on debt per year, we have to pay $138 million. Those all things hem in how much flexibility the government has. Yeah. Now, Cheryl, what's your initial impression of the budget? Pre-budget.
Disappointment is nice term to use. It's almost as if it's been the same. I feel like I say the same thing every year. And I'm sure Craig feels the same way. And we've been nice, I think, but we're going to have to start getting tough on the government, because we're going nowhere very fast, and the numbers don't add up. It's not $3.1 billion in debt. You add all the rest of the liabilities in, and you come up to something like maybe $6 billion that the government is liable for. We've talked about raising taxes. It's been we have to do it. We need revenues. We need to find another income source. And yes, labor is heavily taxed in Bermuda, but only at a certain level. It's the working population that is taxed. It's the people that are making that are feeling the tax. It's not the wealthy. We've got to, as Craig said, we've got to get a capital. We've got to start taxing the corporations. And this 15% global tax that I know they're talking about it and it's coming down the pipeline maybe in 100 years, maybe we need to bring it down the pipeline now. Because whether or not the US is going to implement it and is resisting implementing it along with other nations, there's a reason why we need to implement it. We need to get at those dollars because, you know, we haven't done anything with the hospital. The hospital's budget was cut. When you start cutting essential services, you already had the fire department was all upset because of the staffing issues out at the airport. Um, we have certain requirements that we have to meet.
So like, sorry, when you say like 6 billion and you're adding in the liabilities, so what sort of things are you talking about there that
The
push?
guarantees that we've given, whether it's Morgan's Point, we've given the Fairmont got a guarantee, and the pension fund is unfunded, and all of these liabilities are adding up. And how are they? And we can't pay for them, and we can't cut them. You can't cut the hospital budget, but they have done it in the past. We have an aging population in Bermuda. Our tax base is withering away. And unless we start to get serious and we need to bring in people. And yes, we need to bring back Bermudians to the island, but we need a significant source of people and businesses if we're going to go back and grow business and bring jobs back to this island.
Yeah,
We have climate change coming up.
Right.
What happens if the sea levels, like they're supposed to rise something like 3 meters in the next 10 to 20 years? There's nothing, we can't even pay to harden our island against climate change and rising sea levels. What the people are going to have to flee and go to Canada, go to the US, England, because they won't be able to live in their houses anymore. And we haven't done anything to provide for that.
Talking about jobs that you mentioned in the pre-budget, this open up for both of you, is that they talked about bringing 8,400 jobs or increasing the working numbers by 25%. How do we do that? And the other thing tying in with that, because that'll push us close to the numbers probably about 2008 or so, 2009, when we had 40,000 people working, where people were complaining that a lot of expats are coming in, taking jobs from Bermudians. It was clogging up the traffic in the city, making housing prices go up, and all the added problems that you have when you have more people here.
We had jobs. We were able to feed our children. I'm not saying that's the entire answer. We also have to broaden our economy. And FinTech did not work, and now and it's now, thank God we didn't get FTX. That would have been a serious reputational risk, right, Craig? It doesn't mean that the future of technology and cryptocurrency and so forth isn't in our future, because that's where we're going eventually in the world. But it's not going to bring us an immediate 8,000, 10,000 jobs, which is what we need. It's not going to, we need a new industry. And how long have I been harping on about the fish industry? And but it's not going to happen unless the government decides to work on the regulations and change certain clauses in the ag and fishery laws. This has got to be done. It can't be a slight mention of half a sentence in a pre-budget. This is a pre-budget that's not even indicating a pathway to to getting out of our problems. We need a plan, and there's no plan.
Yeah, on the issue of fishing and farming, when a farmer brings in a piece of equipment, that equipment is subject to duty. which is sort of ridiculous because when you think about agriculture in Canada, in the US, or in the European Union, farm bills are a huge part of the government's budget. So the government does a major part, a major player in making food inexpensive, making, lowering the taxes, subsidies, and so on. And in Bermuda, we have sort of the opposite situation where we tax farmers for their wares. And I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that it's not something that's in the budget, because when the finance minister sought feedback on his budget, I mean, if you look at the list of agencies that he asked, what was it? At the top, there was ABIR, the Association of Bermuda Insurers and Reinsurers. There was ABIC, the Association of Bermuda International Companies. There was the Life Insurance Group. So there were 6 entities that he went to, and half of them were all international business. Also included was the Chamber of Commerce, and I believe the Bermuda,
The hotel sisters,
the
hotel
hotel,
sisters.
and the unions.
Mhm.
So I think it's pretty clear where the finance minister's heart is. It's basically in sort of keeping the peace. And on that note, payroll tax. There was a suggestion in the pre-budget statement that payroll tax for people under $48,000 would go to 0. Well, I don't think that's going to happen, because it's my sense that the international business community pushed back on that proposal, not the part about 0 tax for the first 48,000.
It's
They
the
pushed back on the increase to 13% for incomes over 235, I believe it is.
up to 900,000.
Yeah. So, given that about half of all payroll taxes are coming out of the international business pocketbook, they're using their political economic power to push back. And to be quite frank, I don't like the idea that international business pays so much tax, because it makes us, the idea that the person who's paying the musician gets to call the tune.
Mhm.
And I think we Bermudians need to take responsibility for our own issues and not expect somebody from the outside to come in and magically wipe away our debt or solve our problems. And so I wasn't totally displeased with the reaction coming from the international business community, because I really believe that we're leaning too hard on that group for our salvation. It's as if we've gone from one economic leg back in the 80s, the tourism leg, which was unstable, and we've switched to another economic leg called international business, which is no more stable, and we haven't learned the lesson that diversification is so important.
I
So
think, like in the report you talked about 900,000. I think the report talked about raising that cap to $1 million,
yes,
and with a warning of pushing it too far, then you'll have like the CEOs or other high paid officers leave the island, and then you don't get any of that money.
yeah. And then on the other side, on the employer side, which is really the employer side of employment tax, the employer side of payroll tax is a real nightmare. But the idea that you're going to differentiate, you're creating a new class for international businesses that increase their payroll tax obligations to 10 3/4, which flies in the face of simplicity, just overcomplicating it. And really, the employer side of the payroll tax is a job killer, because when someone's a local entrepreneur growing their business, let's say for sake of argument, their payroll is around $190,000, and they decide to hire someone else, where their payroll tax obligations can more than double by hiring an additional person. That's a job killer. And I'm sort of shocked that the government hasn't instituted a more sensible employer payroll tax system that doesn't act as a disincentive to employers to hire people. Cheryl wants to see businesses hire people. Well, you need to make it less unattractive for employers to expand their labor force. And that's unfortunately what the present system does. I mean, you can take a look at it. It's on page 21 of the pre-budget statement. And if you do your own analysis, it's sort of frightening for an employer and may help explain why job growth in Bermuda is proceeding at an anemic pace.
But
Sorry.
every company in the world has to pay employment payroll taxes of some sort for their employees, and they're usually even higher than what we are requiring our employers to pay. And at some point, if you can't pay basic taxes, then maybe shouldn't be in business to begin with. That's a very crude way of saying that we can't just. We've been going you yourself said we've been going willy-nilly and bowing to international business or businesses and not raising taxes. But if we don't figure something out, we've got to raise taxes. We've got to also bring in businesses, and we've got to stop taxing the working class and small businesses at the rate that we are. And it's not international business that's suffering like we are suffering in terms of paying these taxes.
Yeah, which is my point. So if you're thinking about a small business with a $190,000 payroll, they would pay $3,325 in business payroll tax. They hire someone and their payroll goes to $210,000. Their payroll tax obligation goes to $7,000. That's a 120% increase. So imagine, Don, you've got your small business and you're thinking about hiring, you want to grow it. Well, you're going to think twice about, in fact, taking that employee on. And that's my point. We want businesses to employ people, but you need to make it so that you don't penalize them so heavily. And it's not rocket science. We've solved that problem on the employee side with what's called a marginal tax structure, so that once I go from one threshold to the other, my tax liability doesn't increase by like 100%. It goes up by a couple of percentage points. Why not give that same privilege to employers, the people who are in fact creating the jobs in the first place?
And mainly to your point, I think like the cutoff is like 200,000, and then it goes up. I would have thought that would have been graduated so that
That's my point.
Yeah.
It needs to go, and it needs to go above that million. I know it's a horror. The international business sector is going to scream, but the reinsurance sector, the cat bond sector, they're doing very well, and we're too afraid to get at some of that capital in terms of taxation, and we don't have to tax them to the point where they leave. There is an intermediate space.
How about going after services? I mean, for some reason, we feel like, I understand customs duties. I mean, they've been in place since the 1600s. And we like customs duties because they're easy.
Duties. We can't increase them.
I understand that, but that's my point. We've sort of gotten just about all we can from goods, but more than half of consumer spending is on services. So why are we only taxing half of consumer spending? You tax the goods. Okay, so I'm a wino, I'm a chronic user, and I understand that I have to pay more. But how about on the service side? It just seems like you're leaving money on the table unnecessarily. And of course, it means modifications to the tax administration, but it is well worth it. I mean, basically, we need to collect an additional about $200 million. And where does the $200 million come from? Debt repayment. So we need to get our revenues about $200 million north of spending. And given that government spending is around 1.2 billion, you need about 1.4 billion in tax revenue so that you can take 200 million and systematically pay off your debt. If you don't get that extra 200 million, you're going to be rolling over debt. It's like paying the minimum on your credit card. But in order to get to the 1.4, you can't do with the present tax system. You need to broaden the base, go after capital, go after services, maybe even after a bit of rental income. But these things take work on the part of the government. And from what I can see, there's limited appetite for doing that work to collect those additional hundreds of millions of dollars so that you can, in fact, go off and pay down the debt.
I'm not every of you are maybe familiar, but like over the last year or so, the government has rolled over some of the bonds of the debt that we owe, and now they're not due. The next one that's due is 2027. So we basically have 4 years to get ourselves into a position to actually, instead of refinancing them in 2027 and kicking the can down the road, actually start paying them. And from what I hear from you, Craig, is like we've got to start doing that.
Well, the pre-budget statement says that the plan to begin to make the first down payment on the debt of $50 million was due to start in 2026. They've now said, well, that's off. Which begs the question, so are we talking 2027 before we make that first $50 million payment? And of course, $50 million is a drop in the bucket. If you're going to make a significant dent in the debt, you've got to be talking about something in the region of $200 million. And that over a decade will get you to your target. And the target level of debt is taking it from 3 billion down to 2. So there is no real question about going to zero. The government has set the target of, debt to taxation as 80%. So if given that there is tax revenue of right now 1.2 million, it looks like they'll be very happy with if the debt could settle down around 80% of 1.2 million, which is something like $960 million. And right now we're nowhere near close to that. And what I'm suggesting is that a 200 million a year payment would get us to that target in a decade. But of course, the only way to get there is to expand the tax base. You're not getting there with the existing tax structure.
Yeah, I think like part of the thing for the government is by somehow creating or getting 8,400 more employees that will expand the tax base by increasing the working population.
In other words, grow the economy, and you can collect more in payroll tax, more in customs duties. Yeah, that's a gradualist approach. And sure, you can grow the workforce, but that's only going to take you so far. The other thing is,
Craig, as we said, we've got this aging population. We've also got unfunded social insurance. We've got basic needs in of public services in the public sector, and we're not even talking about how do we fund all of that, and how do we fund climate change, which is going to really hurt us.
Well, here's one positive that I found in the budget statement. The finance minister has said he's going to make the change with respect to social insurance, that is the money going to fund the contributory pension fund, get away from a flat fee and make it progressive so that people at the bottom of the income ladder will pay considerably fewer dollars into that contributory pension fund than, say, someone making $500,000 or even $200,000. That is arguably that's the best news I think that you can find in the pre-budget statement.
It never made any sense that somebody who's making $30,000 a year was paying the same amount as somebody who's making $200,000 a year.
Yes. And so I'm hoping that the finance minister is determined to make that a reality in this fiscal year.
Now, Cheryl was talking about how the government's tried to take some of the burden off the people earning less money, um, $48,000, $36,000 a year, and they have their charts where those people in those salary bands are having to pay 10% less money now because of the various release programs, and with the proposed anybody making under 48,000 not paying any payroll tax to give them even further relief.
Well, I think that particular proposal of total tax relief for people under 48,000, I can't see that materializing because of, I believe, the pushback that would have been gotten at the top end. So you've got the international business community saying this is a non-starter because you want to hit us on the employer side. You're increasing our employer contribution from 10.25 to 10.75. And then you want to tax us as employees. And I believe they said, well, we're going to use our muscle and get you to back off. And I believe the international business community will be successful in getting the finance minister to back down and not increase the top rate to 13%, because the 13% rate was what was going to fund the 0% rate. Mm-hmm. So you can't have one without the other. Yeah. Maybe there'll be some compromise where instead of that bottom band paying 1.5%, maybe it'll go to 1%, and the top may go from I think it's 9 to maybe 12 or 11. So there'll be some sort of horse trading. I'm guessing that's already been done, and we'll have to take it from there.
Now, Cheryl, you mentioned our aging population a couple of times already. This is something that we've been talking about for a few years now, and still not having any real resolution on it. I mean, last year they talked about raising the retirement age to 70. No progress has been really made, at least to the public, of whether or not that's going to happen. And the other problems that come with the aging population: more use of the hospital, more use of public services, more financial assistance as they try to make ends meet.
And we're not renewing our population either.
Right. We saw they haven't released the stats for last year, but the year before we had less than 500 babies, which is the least amount that they have had recorded since they've been keeping records in 1940.
And about 500 people are retiring from the workforce every year. So it's quite possible that our workforce is now under 30,000.
You need something like 1.2 babies per person in order to renew your population. Yeah. I could be off by a 0.1 or something, but that's what you need. And we're not.
Well, we could bring up Dame Lois Brown Evans' famous quote about how to increase the population. But in most Western societies, though, that's the they're all in decline.
They're all in decline. Even China, this registered decline in its population.
I think it was like 500,000 people. They had 500,000 less people this last year.
Yes. There was an article that came, it was everywhere, BBC, CNN, everywhere, in terms of their declining population. Japan is
the worst.
Is the worst of all the different countries. Although, Bermuda's not, I would say, Bermuda's not compared, that we don't, no one talks about it, but I would say we are probably the worst up there with Japan. But we need Cordell here to talk about the statistics. Maybe if we're not renewing our population, it's that tax base is being eroded more and more. You don't have people working to pay taxes into a system that's then going to turn around and support us in our old age. And
when you look at population growth, I mean, the problem, as I see it, that we're having is largely political. the sort of the political will to move immigration reform forward, it's just not forthcoming.
Well, we're caught in this web of arguing, well, there's 1,000 something young Black men that don't have jobs. Before we bring in people or increase our population, we need to get them jobs. Well, we can't get them jobs if we don't have employers to employ them. And somehow that message is not getting out to the general public. And that message has to come out clearly. We need to be writing about it almost every day to make people understand. You want to put our 1,000 young Black men to work, they need employers. We need to bring in businesses, and people are what create businesses. So for me, it's mathematical. It's all about math and numbers. And if we can't make that argument and make people understand that, it's never going to happen, because as you said, it's political.
And at the same time, Cheryl, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that is the business payroll taxes that employers are faced with.
But you've been talking about that for how long have we been on?
Yeah, well, unless you can get them, you might be able to get the entrepreneurs on island, but once they see that if I take on this young Black man, that's going to double my bill, he might just think, you know what, maybe I better stay small, which defeats the whole purpose of folks coming here to create jobs. And so, there are a number of, you need this sort of confluence.
We don't have an income tax. We have a payroll tax.
Yes.
We're not taxing capital. There's so many different ways that we can get around this. And we've got to bring in these businesses, and and for them to ask them to pay 9% or 10% of somebody's salary, when they're going to be making, if you're talking about the reinsurance business and the cat bond business, they are making enough money that they can pay that young Black man's 10% salary tax for the employer.
But I'm actually not thinking about that international business. I'm thinking more about a local entrepreneur.
You're not going to get local. There's no restaurants. There are no small businesses if they're not dependent on a bigger business. You have to. You're an economist. You know this. Money goes from place to place to place. Mm-hmm. It circulates, and the taxi driver is not going to be picking up the big businessman from the airport to take him to his board meeting at XL, because there's no business. He's not coming in. AXA, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is a kind of trickle-down economics. But what I've seen since COVID is a major shift in, I would call this the sort of psychology of work in Bermuda. Young people understand that their fortunes it makes more sense to tie their fortunes to their own prosperity rather than tying it to some mega corporation. And so what I've noticed in the last sort of 3 to 5 years is that the number of young people who have started their own businesses and are not only thinking about growing their businesses locally, but they're thinking globally.
Okay.
That is to be encouraged.
There's a young man, and this is back to fish farming. I know I'm the fish farming lady, but he has a company. He wants to start fish farming. He can't. The regulations, the law, the legislation's not in place. He could have easily 100 or 500 people working in that company, and he would be making enough to pay their payroll tax, pay their salaries, and bring in enough profit for himself and export fish abroad. But
Exactly.
we are not, you're hung up on payroll tax going from 9 to 10 or 12% when he can't even get that company off the ground unless we actually sit down and change the legislation of what is a fish. We put in the regulations for licensing. We actually take the time and do a marine spatial study so that we know where these fish farms are going, where the channel is, where we're not going to let people fish, although that's a whole nother issue. All of this is actually something that we can do. And we would then be promoting local business, a small business, because it's not that big. And he would be able to pay that payroll tax, whether it is 9%, 10%, or even 15%.
I sort of look at what's happened with Mariko Thomas and down in St. George's, where now the economic considerations outweigh the historical and other things. And I think government's becoming more flexible because the economy, I mean, this is just my opinion, but it seems like um, they realize 45 jobs being created outweighs what, the little overhead vent on that building. And it seems like we may be in a new era, maybe signaling a new era where let's cut some of the red tape and get jobs created.
Yeah. And I think young Bermudians are in a new era where they're not only thinking about Bermuda because they understand that scalability in Bermuda is very difficult. And so they're not just thinking local, they are thinking global. And so we have a different kind of young entrepreneur on island right now,
Yeah.
which is a great thing.
And even now, if you look to see what they're doing with the signature schools, there's a heavy emphasis on creating entrepreneurs, giving our high school students an entrepreneurial mindset to go out and create those jobs.
Yeah, it's a different day than, well, I'm going to get a job and work for some big company. That I think is so sort of 20th century, but the big company is going to take care of me. You know, yeah, and I think the policymakers need to sort of understand, and we need to understand that, folks have moved on, and how do you aid and abet economic growth of that particular variety?
We
Now,
need to also be looking at a lot of this and in the backdrop of what's going on internationally with regards to China and the US and whether we're ramping up to another Cold War. The war in Ukraine is going into its second year, and it's supposed to be going to get worse.
climate change, as you mentioned quite a few times.
Yes, and
All,
everybody sort of just waves everybody off at climate change because they think it's down the road. It's not down the road. And we see that just with the town square flooding and the road to St. David's that floods. You can tell I'm from St. George's. Mullet Bay Park floods. So we've got to get on. We've got to figure out how it is such that people will not have to move all to high ground, all over to that hill up in Devonshire, that hill outside of town.
not
What?
Smith Hill, Cox
Yeah,
Hill.
one of those hills.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that is a serious consideration. And then the big elephant in the room is inflation and the rate hikes that keep taking place by the Federal Reserve in the U.S. That affect our mortgage holders, our banks' ability to borrow money, and it's this. We're criticizing the budget, and I'm the first one to scream, "There's no plan, there's no pathway." I'm really upset that it's criminal. They're terrible. But at the same time, looking at what they're facing, I don't in many ways, I get it. It's a very difficult period. I remember, I want to say something like 15 years ago when Paula Cox, the then premier, had to come out with a budget, and it was right at the financial crisis. I think it was 2009. And one of the MPs said to me, "This is one of the toughest budgets that Paula Cox is going to have to come out with. This is really, it's dire." Well, that looked like a playground compared to what we're facing this coming year and 2024, into 2030.
Okay,
And
how about some silver linings?
um,
Two silver linings.
okay, Craig.
One, the hospitality industry has some ways to go before it gets back to the 2019 numbers. And it's quite possible that in this fiscal year, we could in fact get close to the 2019 numbers. That will truly provide an extra couple of thousand jobs. So pre-pandemic, the hospitality sector was employing over 4,000 people. Once the pandemic set in, that number was decimated. We're about halfway there. And so this year we could well see an additional 2,000 jobs created out of a recovering tourist sector.
I hope you're right, because the airlift isn't there.
Yes. So the second silver lining has to do, you mentioned banking. And so arguably the banking system in Bermuda hasn't been this robust, this strong since the early part of the 21st century. And I'm sort of dating around 2003, 2004. And the basis of that judgment is a thing called the loan to deposit ratio. The loan to deposit ratio right now is sub 80%. That means for every dollar in deposits, there are 80 cents worth of loans. At around, in the shadow of the financial crisis, around 2011, 2012, that loan to deposit ratio reached 150%, which means that for every dollar in deposits, the banks had loaned out $1.50, which, when you think about it, is impossible. But they pulled it off by borrowing in US dollars.
US dollars.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so they have sort of amended, they've sort of readied the ship and shored up, I suppose, the barriers, if you will, the financial barriers. And arguably now the financial system, the banking system, is in a position to create new lending, whether it be business lending or lending for real estate or lending to consumers. So in that sense,
the banking system is indeed far shorter. I mean, compared to what was going on in 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, the banking system, it is doing very well. But do you know have you seen what's happened to people's mortgages, the individuals along the way?
Okay, so let's back up to where we've come from. Having those things called low interest rates is in many ways a curse.
But we never had low interest rates here in Bermuda.
True, you don't have low interest, but you're talking about why are interest rates going up globally? They're going up globally because in the United States and in Europe, they have been very, very low. Basically free money. And that free money is not good for business over the long run, because you get people taking ridiculous risks. And so as interest rates go up, the financial system in the United States will have to be a little more responsible with its lending practices. Businesses will have to be a little more responsible in the risks that they take. And so in some ways, that is a necessary part of stabilizing the economic system, in particular, inflation. You mentioned inflation. Well, the way in which central banks fight inflation is by increasing interest rates and slowing down economic activity that's gotten out of hand.
But we have no economic activity, Craig. You're preaching.
I'm explaining why interest rates are rising in Bermuda, because interest rates in Bermuda are tied to interest rates in the United States.
Absolutely.
So we can't do what they did in Turkey, So in Turkey, they decided, you know what? We're not going to follow economic theory. We're going to cut interest rates and go our own way. Well, the lira has depreciated and the Turkish economy is coming apart. So we basically have to follow the lead of what they're doing in the States. When they increase their interest rates, we need to increase our interest rates. We can go into the reasons why, but that's just the reality that we have to deal with.
Yeah, and they're supposed to do it, raise the rates. I think 2 or 3 more times they expect the Fed to raise the rates this year. So we haven't seen the end of it.
We haven't seen the end of it. And the thing is yes, all of that is so true. And that's the backdrop against which we've been talking about this budget. And that's the backdrop against which we're talking about we've got to bring in business and grow our economy when our economy hasn't been growing for quite a while. And we're not in the situation of the United States. We're in a critical situation. And that's why I'm scared. And comment. You said you wanted to say something.
Well, yeah.
Edgewise between the two of us, I know.
I want to talk about one last thing before we close tonight. In the budget, it talks about, or the pre-budget talks about the public sector having lost wages over the last few years, and additionally, government pay scales are no longer competitive with the private sector, especially for specialized roles like legal, engineering, compliance, and finance, which sees the government lose its top employees to the private sector. So they are expecting to pay more to try to retain talent or attract talent. Your thoughts?
Well, if you want talent, talent is scarce. Talent's not going to work for free. And as you pointed out, you can go work in the private sector. And if you don't have it within the government, what I see happening is that the government then goes and hires consultants to do the work for them. And of course, there's a fee attached to that.
Usually a lot more.
But then we get the value-added service tax. And so the government will get it back.
That's one of the reasons why you need to expand the tax base and really get us to the point where the government is in a position to collect about $1.4 billion in taxes. Right now, we're sort of hovering around 1.2, and the magic number is an additional $200 million. Find a way to do that, expand the tax base, and then we can begin this process, this arduous process of paying down the debt. And hopefully by the year 2033, we could say that we've hit the target that we set for ourselves some time ago.
That sounded like your final comment for the evening, Greg, re-emphasizing your point. Cheryl, do you want to have a final say?
The whole problem with inflation is very much the impact on Bermuda is much harsher than what is taking place in the U.S., to be honestly. And we need the economic activity, and we need a full-blown business plan, to be quite honest. And I agree 100%. We've been saying, Craig, myself, Cordell, we've been saying this for years now, that we need to expand the tax base. And that includes more people, that includes looking at capital, that includes getting at the wage earners' salaries that make a whole lot more money. And it doesn't have to be as much that it's going to, that they won't come into Bermuda. It can actually probably be a small percentage, a couple of percentage points that would make a difference for us in Bermuda. I am very concerned about climate change. We have to make some sort of real plan, not lip service in a one sentence, to what's going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years with the rising sea levels. And finally, do not cut essential services. It'll be more expensive to rush people out by air ambulance or or people aren't insured. They're underinsured. They won't be able to be rushed out. So, and they will just die. And we don't want that.
Okay.
So positively, I don't really have anything positive to say. That was the man in the blue shirt.
Well, yeah, I mean, I see not a dark future. I see a bright future, and it's primarily because of what I see in young people, in not only those young entrepreneurs, but those young people who are thinking about getting into reinsurance, those young people who are thinking about getting into science. And so I don't know whether it's because of the lead that came out of the environment, because my generation, we got lead paint, lead toys, lead gasoline, and that affected our intelligence in a major way. And this generation, perhaps because they live in a relatively environmentally clean society, they're a lot smarter than us. And much, I think, of the problems that we face involve us getting out of their way and letting them bring their creative talents to the problems that we face.
Craig and Cheryl, just want to thank you both for being here tonight and lending your intelligence to our economic situation. So thank you very much.
I didn't eat lead.
I did.
I looked at all those metal cars when.
Yes, my fire truck was covered in lead.
Thank you, Don.
You're welcome.
Good to see you, Craig.
Monday night, barring unforeseen circumstances, Bermuda News and Views is supposed to have the Hortons, Randy, Ellen, Kate, and Robert at 6 p.m. So keeping our fingers crossed, everything works out. But we'll have a very interesting conversation with the three and about their careers in education and Black History Month. So tune in Monday at 6, and we'll have a very scintillating conversation. And I just want to thank everyone on behalf of Burn News for tuning in tonight. And as always, have a beautiful evening.